Welcome to International Management Video Lecture. I am Dr. Alicia Brannon-Little, and we will be covering, or I will be covering, Chapter 5, Managing Across Cultures. I'm going to begin with an overview of Chapter 5, and as usual, we will go into more detailed information. The first part of the chapter begins with examining the strategic dispositions that characterize responses to different cultures. One major problem facing multinational corporations is that they sometimes attempt to manage across cultures in ways similar to those of their home country. MNC dispositions toward managing across cultures can be characterized into four different areas. We have ethnocentric, polycentric, geocentric, and regiocentric. These different approaches shape how companies adapt and adjust to cultural pressures all around the world. The middle part of the chapter is a discussion of cross-cultural differences and similarities. One major challenge when dealing with cross-cultural problems is that of overcoming parochialism and simplification. Parochialism is the tendency to view the world through your own eyes and your perspective. Simplification is a process of exhibiting the same orientation toward different cultures or groups. Another problem in domestic markets, which it relates back to doing things the same way as it's done in the foreign market. Research shows that in some cases, this approach can be effective. However, effective cross-cultural management more commonly requires approaches different than those used at home. One area where there is particular evidence of human resource management. Recruitment, selection, training, compensation are all often carried out in different ways in different countries. And what works in the United States may have limited value in other countries and geographic regions. Reviewing cultural differences is discussed in the latter part of the chapter. In select countries and regions, it's going to go over the cultural differences, and there's also some information about important strategic guidelines for doing business. Doing business in various parts of the world requires the recognition and understanding of those different cultures. Some of these differences revolve around the importance that society assigns to time, status, control of decision-making, personal accomplishment, and the work itself. These types of cultural differences help to explain why effective managers in China or Russia often are quite different from those in France, and why a successful style in the United States may be a little different than what would be ideal in Arab countries. This chapter begins with going over the vignette at the beginning, the world of international management, taking a bite out of Apple, corporate culture, and unlikely Chinese startup. So just a quick vignette about the beginning summary that is in chapter 5. It talks about two smartphone companies with a combined 50% share of the market. The two companies have very different cultures and differ greatly in their approach to innovation, supply chain, product lines, and ideas about intellectual property rights. So I'll let you go through that. The two smartphone giants are Apple, which many of you probably have an Apple and are very familiar with. And the other one is Xiaomi. It is a company that is located in China. Some of the questions that you should be familiar with answering, or some things and thoughts that you should have about the discussion between similarities and differences across cultures regarding individuals versus the collective approach for Apple and Xiaomi. You should be able to understand the differences in the approach to the supply chain and the manufacturing process of both of those smartphone companies. And then also the product focus of Apple and how it differs from that of Xiaomi. Also, your last thing that you should be thinking about is analyzing which strategy is working and why. You know, the discussion of the results of cultural differences between Apple and Xiaomi regarding intellectual property and the resulting legal conflicts for each of those companies will help you to gain a better understanding of what is working and what is not, what strategies to implement. And if you want more information about Apple or Xiaomi, of course, you can go to apple.com, or you can go to mi.com/in/for Xiaomi. This chapter begins with the strategy for managing across cultures. Multinational corporations become more transitional, and as they do, their strategies must address the cultural similarities and differences in the varied markets. Renault made a number of strategic decisions that dramatically changed the way it did business. It bought controlling stakes in Nissan Motors of Japan, Samsung Motors of South Korea, and Dacia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the Romanian automaker. Renault's quest for greater global market share continues to progress. So you can see where they are buying in different countries, different cultures, and seem to be using a strategy that is well adapted for their success. Strategic dispositions. So I just highlighted these 4 distinct predispositions that have been identified as ethnocentric, and I'll just go ahead and go into that one now. The ethnocentric predisposition is a nationalistic philosophy of management, whereby values and interests of the parent company guide their strategic decisions. The second one is polycentric predisposition. This one is a philosophy of management whereby strategic decisions are tailored to suit the cultures of the countries where the MNCs operate. The third one is regiocentric disposition. This philosophy of management tries to blend its own interests into those of the subsidiaries on a regional basis. And then there's geocentric disposition. This philosophy of management the company tries to integrate a global system approach the decision-making process to the decision-making process. So they integrate a global system into their decisions. The next part of the chapter is about meeting the challenge. In this section, despite the need for, and in general, the tendency of multinational corporations to address regional differentiation issues, many multinational corporations remain committed to globalization imperative, which is a belief that one worldview approach to doing business is the key to both efficiency and effectiveness. A number of factors are moving companies to facilitate the development of unique strategies for different cultures, including the diversity of worldwide industry standards, such as those in broadcasting, where television sets must be manufactured on a country-by-country basis. Also, a continual demand by local customers for differentiated products, as in the case of consumer goods that must meet local tastes. There's another one, the importance of being an insider, as in the case of customers who prefer to buy local, and then the difficulty of managing global organizations, as in the case of local subsidiaries, that want more decentralized and others that want less. The need to allow subsidiaries to use their own abilities and talents and not be restrained by headquarters, as in the case of local units that know how to customize products of their market and generate high returns on investment with limited production output. Responding to cultural needs of local operations and customers, MNCs find that regional strategies can be effectively incorporated into capturing and maintaining worldwide market niches. The globalization versus national responsiveness challenge is even more acute when marketing cosmetics and other products that vary greatly in consumer use. The need to adjust global strategies for regional markets presents three major challenges for most multinational corporations. The multinational corporation must stay abreast of local market conditions and sidestep the temptation to assume that all markets are basically the same. The multinational corporations must know the strengths and weaknesses of its subsidiaries so that it can provide these units with assistance as needed in addressing local demands. And last, multinationals must give the subsidiary more autonomy so that it can respond to changes in local demands. The next section of the chapter goes over cross-cultural differences and similarities. Cultures can be similar and quite different across countries. This is a tongue twister for me. The challenge for MNCs is to recognize and effectively manage the similarities and differences. We're going to go into parochialism and simplification. Parochialism is a tendency to view the world in your own eyes. This can be a strong temptation for many international managers who often come from advanced economies and believe that the state-of-the-art knowledge that they possess is more than adequate to handle the challenges of doing business in less developed countries. In addition, many of these managers have a parochial point of view fostered by their background. Then there is simplification, a process of exhibiting the same orientation toward different cultural groups. For example, the way in which a US manager interacts with a British manager in the same way in which he or she behaves when doing business with an Asian executive. Understanding the culture in which they do business can make international managers more effective. Most international managers are more culturally knowledgeable, so they often misinterpret what is happening. They're not more culturally knowledgeable. So then they misinterpret what is happening. I had to think about what I said. Malaysia has what could be more called a high context culture, which possesses characteristics such as relationships between people are relatively long-lasting, communication is often implicit, people in authority are personally responsible for the actions of their subordinates, agreements tend to be spoken rather than written, and insiders and outsiders are easily distinguishable. So the Malaysian cultural characteristics are markedly different from those of a low context culture, such as in the United States, where we possess relationships between people that are relatively short in duration. Our messages are explicit. Authority is diffused throughout the bureaucratic system. Agreements tend to be in writing rather than just spoken, and insiders and outsiders are not readily distinguishable. Not everything is totally different, but some approaches that work at home can also work well in other cultural settings. Next is similarities across cultures. When internationalization began to take off in the 1970s, many companies quickly adapted, and it would not be possible to do business in the same way in every corner of the globe, of course. There was a secret hope, however, that many of the procedures and strategies that worked well at home could also be adopted overseas without modification. This has proved to be false, as you probably know. At the same time, some similarities across cultures have been uncovered by researchers. Luthans and associates studied through direct observations of a sample of managers in a large textile factory in Russia to determine their activities. They found out that Russian managers carried out traditional management, communication, human resources, and networking activities. They also found that relative attention given to the networking activity increased the Russian managers' opportunities for promotion. The next section briefly talks about many differences across cultures. Despite similarities between cultures in some studies, far more differences than similarities have been found. So there is understanding the human management resource strategies before becoming a manager in the industry that can aid in effective performance. Evaluations can be quite different from country to country because what is regarded as most important criterion in one subsidiary might be ranked much lower on the evaluation list of another subsidiary. Human resource management differences can be found in areas of wages, compensation, pay equity, and maternity leave. It is possible to link cultural clusters and compensation strategies. You can refer to Table 5.3, which shows a host of different cultural groupings, and 5.2 shows how specific HRM areas can be analyzed contingently on a country-by-country basis. Just keep in mind that managing across cultures requires careful understanding of the local environment. The next section of the chapter goes into cultural differences in selected countries and regions. Certain regions of the world have similar cultures. Using the GLOBE project to compare managerial differences, there's an examination of the GLOBE project that resulted in an extensive breakdown of how managers behave and how different cultures can yield managers with similar perspectives in some realms, with quite divergent opinions in other sectors. One interesting development is the increasing frequency of managers and executives from one part of the world assuming leadership roles in another part of the world. Managing culture in selected countries and regions. Business people from all cultures are individuals with unique personalities and styles. There are also exceptions to the general cultural characteristics discussed in some of the information that is to follow in the textbook. Stereotyping in one cross-cultural dealings is unwarranted, and we'll get into that in a moment. Managing culture in China. China is rapidly trying to close the gap between itself and economically advanced nations and to establish itself as a power in the world economy. China is actively trading in world markets. It is a member of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and it is a major trading partner in the United States. So despite the global presence, many US and European multinationals still find that doing business in China can be a long, grueling process. Foreign organizations still find it difficult to make a profit in China. One major reason is that Western-based multinational corporations do not appreciate the important role and impact of the Chinese culture. When dealing with Chinese, one must keep in mind that patience is of critical importance. Another important dimension of Chinese culture is, I'm going to spell it and then I'm going to say it, Guanxi. Now, I may or may not be pronouncing this right, but I pronounce it Goxi. And this means good connections. It is important to be a good listener. That's a difficult one for many of us. It's easier for us to talk than it is for us to listen. So, as we should do, be a good listener, especially when we're going to other countries and talking to people of other cultures. When connecting business in China, you have to realize that Chinese people are a collective society in which people pride themselves on belonging to or being members of a group, belonging to a group. Chinese people are very proud of their collective economic accomplishments and want to share these feelings with outsiders. This is a sharp contrast to the situation in the United States and other Western cultures and countries, where individualism is highly prized. For this reason, one must never single out a Chinese employee and praise him or her for a particular quality, such as intelligence or kindness, because doing that may embarrass that individual in the presence of their peers. It is equally important to avoid using self-centered conversations, such as extensive use of the word I, because it appears that the speaker is trying to single him or herself out for special consideration. In negotiations, reciprocity is important. Because negotiation can involve a loss of face, it is common to find Chinese carrying out the whole process through intermediaries. During negotiations, it is important not to show extensive emotion of any kind. Negotiation should be viewed with a long-term perspective. Your text also goes into managing across cultures in Russia. The Russian economy has experienced severe problems, and the risk of doing business cannot be overstated. At the same time, however, by following certain guidelines, MNCs can begin to tap into the potential opportunities that are there. Some suggestions that if you're going to do business in Russia are to build personal relationships with partners, use local consultants, consider business ethics, be careful about compromising or settling things too quickly. And written contracts are not as binding to Russians as they are to Western culture individuals. Then there is managing culture in India. In recent years, India has begun to attract the attention of large MNCs. Unsaturated consumer markets, coupled with cheap labor and production locations, have helped make India a desirable market for global organizations. When doing business in India, one will find a number of other customs useful to understand, such as shaking hands with male business associates is almost always an acceptable practice. U.S. business people in India are considered equals. However, the universal method of greeting an equal is to press one's palms together in front of their chest and say, Namaste, which means greetings to you. For Western business people in India, shirt, trousers, tie, and suit are proper attire. In the southern part of India, where the climate is very hot, a light suit is preferable. In the north, during the winter, a light sweater or jacket are a good choice. Indian business people, on the other hand, often wear local dress. It is important to remember that Indians are very tolerant of outsiders and understand that many are unfamiliar with the local customs and procedures. Therefore, there is no need to make any phony attempts to conform to Indian culture traditions, because making an effort to be polite and courteous would be sufficient enough. Managing culture in France. So many in the United States believe that it is more difficult to get along with the French than it is with other Europeans. This feeling probably reflects the French culture, which is markedly different than what we are doing in the United States. The French are very status conscious, and they like to provide signs of their status, such as knowledge of literature and the arts, or well-defined, tasteful, decorated houses, and a high-quality education. Many French people are not motivated by competition, or they're not motivated by the desire to emulate fellow workers. Most French organizations tend to be highly centralized and have rigid structures. In French companies, top managers have far more authority than the United States managers, and they are less accountable for their actions. While top USA executives must continually defend their decisions to the CEOs and to the board of directors, French executives are challenged only if the company has poor performance. What about managing cultures in Brazil? Brazil is considered a Latin American country, but it is most important to highlight that this nation, since some characteristics may be different to manage as compared to other Latin countries, is still, very significant. So some of those factors when pursuing business in Brazil are the physical contact is acceptable form of communication. Face-to-face interaction is preferred as a way of communication. Appearance is very important. Patience is very important. The slow processes and relaxed environment do not imply that it is acceptable to be ill prepared. So that gives you a little bit of insight into Brazil. Now we're going to talk about Arab countries. The intense media attention given to the Iraq War, terrorist actions, and continuing conflicts in the Middle East have perhaps revealed to everyone that Arab cultures are distinctly different from Anglo cultures. Americans often find it extremely hard to do business in Arab cultures, and a number of Arab cultural characteristics can be cited for this difficulty. It is important to understand that Arab culture generally holds that destiny depends more on the will of a supreme being than on the behavior of individuals. A higher power dictates the outcome of important events, so individual action is of little consequence. Social status is largely determined by family position and connections, not necessarily by your accomplishments. Arabs attract a great deal of importance to status, or they attach a great deal of importance to status and rank. Other useful guidelines for doing business in Arab cultures are going to include, when you're meeting with them, you should pay deference to the senior person first. So you should pay, I guess I'm saying this wrong. So when you are meeting someone from an Arab culture, you should pay deference to the senior person first. It is also important never to criticize or berate anyone publicly. This causes the individual to lose face, and the same is true for the person who makes these comments. Mutual respect is required at all times. That gives you a little bit of insight to the different cultures, the Arab culture, the Brazil, France, India, Russia, and China, as it is compared to the United States. And some of you may be comparing your country to the United States. And there are differences and similarities that work. Some of the questions that hopefully you'll be able to reflect on are the 4 basic predispositions multinational corporations have toward their international operations. Remember, we talked about ethnocentric, polycentric, regiocentric, and geocentric. And then there are some key terms that you need to keep in mind, which are those 4 predispositions, and then also globalization imperative, and the term for the Chinese term for good connections. Then there's parochialism, there is simplification. So be familiar with those terms. One of the questions that you have is, if a locally based manufacturing firm with sales of $350 million decided to enter the European Union market by setting up operations in France, which orientation would be most effective? Ethnocentric, polycentric, geocentric, or regiocentric or geocentric? Why or why not? Explain your choice. A little bit of insight into that. The effectiveness of the orientation is going to depend on a number of factors. For example, if the firm uses a flexible manufacturing system, a regio or geocentric orientation would be appropriate. A batch production system would warrant a polycentric orientation, and a mass production system would warrant an ethnocentric orientation. So you can get a little bit of an idea how it depends on the type of manufacturing processes. The organization strategy is another important factor. Is the organization concerned with global integration, national responsiveness, regional integration, or a combination of these? The existing structure of the organization and the organization's willingness to deviate from its existing structure would be another important factor. If the organization is set on a hierarchical product division structure, it would tend to adopt an ethnocentric orientation. If the organization is currently using or is open to the possibility of a matrix structure, then regio structure may be more appropriate. These factors and a number of other factors which make up the profile of the organization will ultimately determine which orientation is likely to be the most effective. Those are the only ones I will address. You do have some others that include you responding to parochialism and simplification, if you're looking at all of the discussion questions that are listed in the text. And then you have some that are going to go over how MMCs would do business overseas, as opposed to what they're doing domestically. And then local managerial approaches and categories of cultural differences that will help make one country or region of the world different from another. What are those categories? And you probably know some of them. Maybe the way you dress, the way you eat, negotiation styles, the way that business is done, your attitude toward affection. Many of those different things would be discussed under this particular question. Okay, now you have some other questions that you can address that have to do with the international spotlight, Poland. Remember, after every chapter, there is a country that you will have to answer questions about. So it gives you just a general overview of that country. And then there are a few questions that you will answer. I did not mention it in the previous video, but from time to time, I will remind you that there are countries at the end of the chapter, and you already know this anyway, and that you will have to answer certain questions pertaining to that country. For chapter 4, which I didn't mention previously, but the country that you will address for that chapter will be focused on the information that is in the textbook, and it always relates back to the country. There is going to be South Africa, but it's always going to relate back to an international perspective going into that country. And then, of course, that's the That's for chapter 4. For chapter 5, your international spotlight is focused on Poland. So there will be some questions that you will answer pertaining to the international aspect of doing business in Poland. That will conclude our conversation and my video lecture. I guess it's not much of a conversation since you don't get to interact with me, but you do get to do that online. So keep in mind that you can reply, we can talk in the chat forum, we can do another video conference, but this way you're able to gain the information and move forward through the course materials and be able to be successful in class. If you have any questions, you can contact me via email. I will respond within 24 hours or less. Until we meet for the next video conference, have a great week.